Thus we see that PTSD has become something quite specifically defined by the modern medical community. However, this concept has really only come into focus within the last century, despite trauma being a near constant feature of the human condition since our earliest days of being stalked by predators. But before we look specifically at the cases related to ancient warriors, I wanted to quickly review the emergence of PTSD as a classified medical phenomenon. The first real attempts to formally grapple with problems
Avoid the gas.
trauma
Get to the
start
safe
around
zone.
the 1800s during the large-scale military
Anybody need
conflicts
this?
of the period, including the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, and the Franco-Prussian War. For instance, physicians were increasingly paying attention to reports from soldiers who both felt missing home, feeling sad, having trouble sleeping, and experiencing anxiety. Such phenomena were sometimes described as being caused by a psychological state of nostalgia. Other times, doctors associated them with physical conditions. For instance, it was common to say that those who suffered from anxiety, a rapid pulse, and trouble breathing had a soldier's heart, which was believed to result from overstimulation of the heart. Another common diagnosis was something called railway spine, which suggested that symptoms manifested as a result of injury to the central nervous system, which appeared to occur in passengers who were scarred by traumatic
Enemy
railway.
soldier incoming.
The early 1900s brought yet more combat with the advent of the World War. The nature of combat had evolved quite a lot by this point, with longer-lasting fights that featured increasingly
You're in the
destructive
gulag
weaponry,
now.
such as
Fight to earn
artillery.
redeployment.
During World War I, for example, there was a massive problem of soldier burnout at the front, with many troops suffering crippling symptoms, which included things like insomnia, panic, and paralysis. Initially, this was identified as shell shock, owing to the idea that perhaps explosions were causing hidden brain damage. But as the symptoms continued to manifest in a wide variety of cases that did not involve artillery, it became more generally
Listen up,
referred to as
soldier.
a sort of war
Win here and you
neurosis.
return to the front line.
Medical treatment
But if you
varied,
lose,
and
you're
could range from
done.
a couple days rest in the rear
You're up,
to
soldier.
even
Go sort this
electrotherapy.
fucker out.
The following interwar years saw increased medical attention to the war neurosis, which seemed to still haunt many veterans. It proved of particular interest to military leaders who knew that this was an issue that would surely arise in future conflicts. And indeed, the Second World War would see a huge resurgence as soldiers became weary and exhausted following prolonged combat service. This sort of psychological strain proved so severe that it is estimated nearly half of all U.S. military discharges were due to some form of combat exhaustion. The medical community, which inspected these cases, no longer used the term shell shock,
Anybody need this?
and instead applied the more broad term combat stress reaction. Their studies were largely guided by the influential theories of behaviorism and psychology, which tended to focus on specific environmental stimuli.
Supply box
Preventing
marked.
CSR
Secure
was
the
therefore
package.
a matter of reducing stress factors in the wartime environment by promoting close relations within units for emotional support and treating casualties with principles of proximity, immediacy, and expectancy. However, there was still very little understanding of what to do with long-term symptoms, and very little medical infrastructure in place to keep up with the demand. Towards the end of the war, the U.S. Veterans Affairs therefore began establishing many clinical psychological training institutions at major universities to birth a new wave of graduates who could help tackle the issue. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association produced the first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, which included
objective
gross
located.
stress reaction. However, while this was a step in the right direction, the diagnosis still failed to properly understand the full scope and duration of the issue at hand. 3 years later, the U.S. entered the Vietnam War in 1955, which would last nearly 2 decades. Once again, participants fell victim to the psychological damage of the war. Studies at the time, for instance, show that 10% of mobilized American men were hospitalized for mental disorders, and of those that underwent 35 days of uninterrupted combat, 98% manifested psychiatric
Got gas
disturbances.
moving in.
The scale of the issue was not just something that doctors dealt with, but now the general public did too.
Next
For
objective
example, in
located.
pop culture, it proved increasingly common to see the crazy Vietnam veteran character show up in all kinds of media. All of this attention, and the further study of returning veterans, Holocaust survivors, sexual trauma victims, and others, eventually led to the first appearance of the term post-traumatic stress disorder in 1978, which was soon officially codified in the 1980 publication, the DSM-3. Its inclusion was the sign of the increasing
Primary objective
medicalization of mental
accomplished. All
illness
supply
and the
boxes
general
found.
maturation of the field of psychiatry. Over the following years, there would be much more research on the subject of PTSD, which continues to this day. The shift to asymmetric combat in recent wars and the rise of terrorist incidents at home have generated even more cases to study. But perhaps one of the most important findings of recent years is the general prevalence of PTSD, which extends far beyond those with military experience. For instance, the VA cites recent data that shows that about 4% of American men and 10% of American women could be diagnosed with PTSD in their lifetime. This realization is vital to the destigmatization of PTSD and the way we approach mental health in general. It's in this context that researchers have looked to the past for clues as to how such mental issues have manifested in history. Right off the bat, we have to set something straight. It is generally bad medical practice to make a diagnosis without seeing or interviewing a patient. Identifying PTSD in a living, breathing patient is hard enough as it is, and doing so for those in the past is quite daunting. With enough documentation,
Strap
such
in.
assessments might be made tentatively, but for the sort of evidence we get dating back more than a few hundred years, we can only ever be considered highly speculative in our analysis.
Enemy
That being
UAV
said,
overhead.
it is still worth taking a look at some of the evidence researchers commonly consider. Some of the earliest records of note come from ancient Assyrian medical texts that describe patients who experience depression, slurred speech, loss of cognitive function, and vivid nightmares. Here's a particularly detailed passage. Quote, if in the evening he sees either a person living or dead, known or unknown, or anybody or anything becomes afraid, he turns around. But like one who has been hexed in rancid oil, his mouth is seized that he is unable to cry out to one who sleeps next to him. Something of medical interest is clearly going on here, despite the claims of ancient Assyrians that it was vengeful ghosts and spirits that went. Perhaps some form of trauma is at work, owing to the brutal nature of Assyrian warfare and their intense re-rotational cycle of recruitment. But again,
Got a
we can't
vendor
know
if you
for
need
sure.
gear.
Other often cited examples come from classical antiquity. In Greece, for example, we have an account from Herodotus describing the experience of a hoplite who faced the Persians at Marathon in 490 BC.
Strap in, I'm
There
trying.
fell in this battle of Marathon on the side of the barbarians about 6,400 men, on that of the Athenians 190. Such was the number of the slain on the one side and the other. A strange prodigy likewise happened at this fight. Epizelus, the son of Pythagoras, an Athenian, was in the thick of the fray and behaving himself as a brave man should, when suddenly he was stricken with blindness without blow of sword or dart. And this blindness continued thenceforth during the whole of his afterlife. The following is the account which he himself, as I have heard, gave of the matter. He said that a gigantic
Got a
warrior
vendor
with
if
a
you need
huge
gear.
beard, which shaded all his shield, stood over him, but the ghostly semblance passed him by, and slew the man at his side. Such, as I understand, was the tale which Epizelus told. From Xenophon, we hear of a Spartan commander who had so long been exposed to war that he became violent and quick to anger, which made him ill-suited for civilian life. Quote, such conduct as this, in my opinion, reveals a man fond of
Strap
war.
in, I'm trying.
When he may enjoy peace without dishonor or harm, he chooses war. When he may live in idleness, he prefers toil, provided it be the toil of war. When he may keep his money without risk, he likes to diminish it by carrying on war. As for Clericus, just as one spends upon a loved
Hold
one
on,
or
I'm
upon
heading
any
your
other
way.
pleasure, so he wanted to spend upon war. Such a lover he was of war. From Hippocrates, we get a description of two civilians who may have also been victims of PTSD.
Gas is moving in.
The first
Safe
female
zone
patient is said
located.
to have been gripped by fear, depression, and incoherent speech, while the second would, quote, fumble, pluck, scratch, pick hairs, weep, and laugh but not speak. In the Roman era, we have additional accounts of how soldiers and civilians alike reacted to traumatic events. Some extend to describing entire communities, as is the case of this passage from Livy describing the Second World War. Quote, the longer the war continued, and the more men's minds as well as their fortunes were affected
Strap
by
in,
the
I'm trying.
alternations of success and failure, so much the more did the citizens become the victims of superstition, and those for the most part formless. It seemed as though either the characters of men or the nature of the gods had undergone a sudden change. The Roman ritual was growing into disuse, not only in secret and in private houses,
Strap in,
but in
I'm trying.
public places, in the Forum and the Capitol. Crowds of women were to be seen who were offering neither sacrifices nor prayers in accordance with the ancient usage. Unauthorized sacrifices and diviners had got possession of men's minds, and the numbers of their dupes were swelled by the crowds of country people whom poverty or fear had driven into the city, and whose fields had lain untilled owing to the length of the war, or had been desolated by the enemy. Likewise,
Got a
in the
vehicle
medieval
here.
era, we get
Right.
accounts of clearly traumatic situations that could trigger a psychological reaction, like PTSD. Here's a passage from the journal of Geoffroy de Charny. Quote, "In this profession, one has to endure heat, hunger, and hard work,
Gas is
to
moving.
sleep little and often be watched, to be exhausted, to sleep uncomfortably on the ground, only to be abruptly awakened. And you will be powerless to change the situation. You will often be afraid when you see your enemies coming towards you, with lowered lances to run you through, and with drawn swords to cut you down.
Strap in, I'm driving.
Bolts and arrows come at you, and you do not know how to best protect yourself. You see people killing each other, fleeing, dying, and being taken prisoner, and you see the bodies of your
Mark
dead
out,
friends
moving.
lying before you." Throughout the history books, you can find many other mentions of individuals displaying symptoms that one could potentially
Loadout
relate
drop
to
headed your
PTSD.
way.
Things like depression, mood swings, paranoia, insomnia, shaking, loss of appetite, avoidance of crowds, and impulsive violence. With these examples, we get a sense of just how tantalizing such morsels of information can be, but also how inadequate they are in providing enough information to make any definitive medical assessment.
I'll drive.
At best, we can conclude that there was indeed a psychological toll beyond just the physical scars of combat. But whether or not this met our modern standards for PTSD is a subject of much debate. But even this general,
I'll
vague
drive.
conclusion brings with it a lot of contentious baggage to discuss. Who defines what is traumatic, and who decides what actions are symptomatic behavior? I'll provide some examples to clarify what I mean. Let's say, for instance, that today you went out in the streets and saw someone slit the throat of a bull and take a shower in its swimming blood. It's pretty safe to say that the sight would be shocking to most. But in the past, this might be the standard routine of your local priest performing a parochial ritual. Nothing out of the ordinary here. And what if today you were to attend a funeral and see someone wailing uncontrollably at the top of their lungs, tearing at their clothes, their hair, and their skin? You might expect something was really wrong. Well, in the Roman era, and other eras, that sort of reaction was just expected, and one might even hire professional mourners to ensure that things felt just right. If you just sat there silently dabbing your eye with a cloth, perhaps something was wrong with you. Think also of the idea of public executions that today would shock most audiences, but in the past would draw huge crowds. For more on this particular subject, I recommend you check out Dan Carlin's episode on painful training. These examples hopefully expose just how relative the whole study of
Strap
trauma
in, I'm
and
driving.
reactions to it can be. What might be shocking to some may not be to others, but either way, we all have our breaking points. Normal is very much a factor of your typical environment. There are all sorts of factors baked into this. Exposure to violence, ideas of morality, cultural expectations, education, and wants. Our discussion thus far has been very blessed, in particular American setting, attempting to project our own norms onto other cultures today, especially those of the past that were risk high levels of bias. We will probably need a whole other episode to further explore this fascinating idea. For example, what would be considered traumatic for a knight with strict ideas of honor, or for a Roman soldier with strong societal expectations of pride and shame? Let me know if this is something you'd be interested in diving into more deeply. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. A huge thanks to our patrons for supporting the channel, and the many researchers, writers, and artists who make this video possible. See you in the next one.
Gas is moving in. New safe zone located. Gas is inbound. Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy UAV overhead. Supply box located. Move to secure. Gas is moving in. New safe zone located.
Moving up.
Losing ground.
Got some cash here.
Gas is moving in. New safe zone located. We've got a loadout drop inbound. Enemy dropping into the AO. Enemy UAV overhead. Contract failed. Let's sharpen up. 10 remaining. Keep it up. You're losing ground. You're being tracked by an enemy team. Stay sharp. Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy UAV overhead. You've got gas inbound. Safe zone relocated. Gas is closing in. Gas is closing in. Relocating the safe zone. Five remaining.
Ports uploaded. Call for fire.
This is Loader 2-0. Good copy. Cluster strike away.
Got gas moving in. got gas inbound. Safe zone relocated. Gas is closing in. They picked the wrong fight. Well done.